The discovery, the sun bled red across the Arizona plains, painting the sagebrush and cracked earth in hues of fire. Ellie McGraw, a solitary cowboy with a face carved by wind and regret, rode his mare, Juniper, through the vast emptiness of the 1870s Southwest. His hat sat low, shielding eyes that had seen too much. War, death, and the slow erosion of his own soul. The air was dry, carrying the faint tang of dust and creosote, and the only sound was the rhythmic clop of hooves and the whistle of a lonesome wind. Eli was tracking a dozen missing cattle. Strays from the herd he tended for a rancher out of Tucson. The trail had led him far from the grazing lands, into a stretch of wilderness where the bones of the Apache War still littered the earth. Arrowheads, rusted spurs, and unspoken grief. He wasn't a man given to fear, but something about this place set his nerves on edge. The silence felt wrong, like the world was holding its breath. Then he saw her. She hung from the gnarled limb of a lone cottonwood tree, her body swaying gently in the evening breeze. A young Apache girl, no more than 16, her dark hair tangled and her eyes closed as if in sleep. A rope bit into her neck, and her hands were bound behind her back. Eli's breath caught, his heart a hammer in his chest. He slid from Juniper's saddle, his boots crunching on the parched ground, and approached slow, like he was walking toward a ghost. A crude wooden sign hung around her neck, the words scrawled in black pitch. "White man don't forgive." Eli stood frozen, his shadow long and then across the earth. The girl's face was serene, almost peaceful, but the brutality of her death screamed in the stillness. He'd seen hangings before. Deserters, outlaws, men who'd earned their noose. But this was different. This was a child. A girl who'd done no wrong save being born Apache in a land still raw with hate. He reached out, his calloused fingers brushing the edge of the sign. The words burned into him, each letter a barb. He'd fought in the wars, ridden with men who saw Apaches as less than human. He'd never raised his rifle, never spilled blood himself, but he'd stood by. Watched, said nothing. That silence clung to him now, heavy as the dust on his coat. "Who did this to you?" he whispered, his voice rough as gravel. The girl didn't answer. The wind did, howling low through the branches, carrying the weight of her unavenged soul. The weight of the past. That night, Eli camped a mile from the cottonwood, unable to ride further. He built no fire, fearing it would draw eyes, human or otherwise. The stars above were cold and different, and as he lay on his bedroll, the girl's face haunted him. He closed his eyes, but the past came rushing back, unbidden. Flashback: Fort Bowie, 1869. Ellie, younger but already hardened, stood in the dusty courtyard of the cavalry outpost. The air stank of sweat and gunpowder. Apache prisoners, men, women, children, were herded like cattle, their eyes hollow with defeat. A sergeant, a man named Cutler with a scar like a lightning bolt across his cheek, spat orders to the soldiers. "No mercy," he'd said, "they're vermin." Eli had been a scout, not a soldier, hired to track Apache raiders through the canyons. He'd done his job, led the cavalry to their camps, but he'd never joined the killing. He told himself it wasn't his fight, that he was just a man earning his pay. But he'd seen the aftermath. Villages burned, bodies left for the vultures. He'd seen children torn from their mothers, heard screams that echoed in his dreams, and he'd said nothing. One memory burned brighter than the rest. A girl, maybe 10, clutching a rag doll as soldiers dragged her family away. Her eyes had met Eli's, wide and pleading, but he'd turned away. He'd mounted his horse and ridden back to camp, telling himself it wasn't his place to intervene. That girl's face blurred into the one he'd seen today, hanging from the tree. Were they the same? He didn't know. But the guilt was. Eli sat up, his breath ragged. Juniper snorted softly, sensing his unrest. He pulled a flask from his saddlebag and took a long pull of whiskey, but it did nothing to dull the ache. The sign's words echoed in his minding. "White man don't forgive." He wasn't the one who tied the rope, but he was part of the world that had. His silence, his inaction, had helped weave the news. The burial dawn broke gray and heavy, the sky bruised with clouds. Ellie returned to the cottonwood. The girl still hung there, her body stiff, her face unchanged. He couldn't leave her like that, exposed to the elements, a trophy for whoever had done this. He cut the rope with his knife, catching her slight frame as she fell. She was light, too light, like a bird with broken wings. He dug a grave with his hands and a flat stone, the earth resisting every scoop. His fingers bled, but he didn't stop. The act felt like penance, though he knew it wasn't enough. As he worked, he spoke to her, his voice low and unsteady. "I'm sorry," he said. "I don't know your name, but you deserved better. You deserved a life." He wrapped her in his spare blanket, tucking it gently around her like a mother might. The sign he buried separately, deep in the earth, as if he could bury the hatred it carried. When the grave was filled, he marked it with a single stone, smooth and white, plucked from a nearby creek bed. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Kneeling by the grave, Ely felt something crack inside him. He'd spent years running from his past, from the war, from the man he'd been. But this girl, this stranger, had reached into his soul and torn it open. He couldn't do what had been done, but he could do something now. He could give her back to her people. The journey, Ely didn't know where to start, but he knew he couldn't stay still. The Apache were scattered, driven from their lands by settlers and soldiers, but rumors spoke of small bands hiding in the mountains. He saddled Juniper and rode north, following faint trails and old memories from his scouting days. The land was unforgiving, cacti like sentinels, cliffs that loomed like judgment. But Ely pressed on, driven by a need he couldn't name. Days passed, each one a blur of heat and dust. He stopped at trading posts, asking cautious questions about Apache sightings. Most folks spat at the mention, their eyes hard with mistrust. One old trapper, half-blind and drunk on mescal, pointed him toward the Dragoon Mountains. "They're ghosts now," the man said, "but you might find him up there, if they don't find you first." Ely rode into the mountains, his senses sharp. He knew the risks. Apache warriors didn't take kindly to white men, especially not ones riding alone. But he carried no rifle, only his revolver, and he kept his hands visible. At night, he lit small fires, hoping the smoke would signal his presence without seeming a threat. On the 5th day, they found him. The clash and the trust they came at dusk, shadows moving silent as wolves. 4 Apache warriors, their faces painted with ochre and ash, surrounded him before he could blink. Their knives gleamed in the fading light, and their eyes held no mercy. Ely raised his hands slow, his heart steady despite the danger. "I ain't here to fight," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm looking for the family of a girl. She's dead. I buried her." The leader, a man with a scar across his brow, stepped forward. His name, Ely would later learn, was Taza, a warrior hardened by loss but not yet broken by it. He spoke in halting English, his voice sharp as flint. "Why you care for a Apache girl? White men kill. White men hate." Ely met Taza's gaze unflinching. "I found her hanging from a tree. Sign said, 'A white man don't forgive.' I didn't do it, but I ain't proud of what my kind's done. I want to bring her home." Taza's eyes narrowed, searching Ely's face for lies. The other warriors murmured, their hands tight on their weapons. For a moment, Ely thought it would end there, his blood soaking the earth. But Taza raised a hand, silencing his men. "Show us," he said. Ely led them back to the cottonwood, a 3-day ride. The grave was untouched, the white stone still in place. Taza knelt beside it, his fingers tracing the earth. He spoke softly in Apache, words Ely could understand but felt in his bones. When Taza stood, his face was unreadable. "Her name was Nishoni," he said. "My sister's child. She was taken last moon. We thought she ran. Now we know." Ely's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." Taza didn't answer, but he didn't strike either. That night, they camped together, an uneasy truce. Over the fire, Ely shared his story. Not all of it, but enough. The wars, his silence, the guilt that had followed him like a shadow. Taza listened, his face carved from stone, but his eyes softened just a fraction. "You carry heavy heart," Taza said, "but heart alone does not heal." The redemption, Taza agreed to take Ely to Nishoni's family, a small band hidden deep in the mountains. The journey was tense, every step a test of trust. The Apache watched Ely like hawks, but he kept his word, his action steady. When they reached the camp, Nishoni's mother, a woman named Chi, wept at the news. She didn't speak to Ely, but her grief was a language he understood. He stayed with the band for days, helping where he could. Holding water, mending hides. Small acts that built a fragile bridge. One evening, Chi approached him, her eyes red but steady. She held out a small beaded bracelet, Nishoni's, and pressed it into his hand. You buried her, she said through Taza's translation. You gave her peace. This is hers. Keep it. Ely took the bracelet, his fingers trembling. It was the first time in years he felt something like forgiveness. Not from Chi, but from himself. He stayed one more night, sitting by the fire as the Apache songs of loss and resilience. He didn't understand the words, but he felt their weight, their hope. When he left, Taza rode with him to the edge of the mountains. You are not like our white men, Taza said, but you are still white. Do not forget what you have seen. Ely nodded, the bracelet heavy in his pocket. I won't. The reflection Ely returned to his solitary life, but he was changed. The plains felt wider, the sky heavier, but the weight in his chest was lighter. He wore Najoni's bracelet on his wrist, a reminder of her life and his promise. He began to speak out, quietly at first, then louder. At trading posts, in saloons, he told her story. Not to preach, but to bear witness. Some listened. Others turned away. But he spoke anyway, breaking the silence he'd carried too long. Years later, when his time came, Eli died alone under a wide desert sky. They found him near a cottonwood tree, a white stone by his side, the bracelet still on his wrist. The rancher who buried him said it was as if he'd chosen that spot, near the girl he'd never known but had carried in his heart. For those who heard his story, Ali McGraw became a whisper on the wind, a tale of a man who'd seen the worst of humanity and chosen to do better. His life asked a question that lingered long after he was gunning. What does it mean to stay silent in the face of wrong? And what does it take to break that silence, to reach across a divide to heal? The desert keeps its secrets, but it also keeps its lessons. Ella's ride, once lonely, became a path toward redemption. Not just for him, but for anyone willing to listen.